Welcome back to Seeking the Truth about the Sword of Truth. My name is Tom, and I will be your guide as we spend this episode exploring Chapter 4 of Wizard's First Rule. In our last episode, we explored the establishment of several key archetypes that become core themes for the entire series, as well as Richard's inner struggle against a very deep childhood trauma. Please note that these episodes contain spoilers, heavy spoilers, not just for this chapter, but for future chapters and books in the series. If you haven't read the series yet, and you intend to, I'd encourage you to read the books first, and then come back and see what I think about them. Spoiler alert, I think the series is pretty good. We begin the chapter with Richard and Kaylin entering the forest after walking away from Michael's house. Richard attempts to apologize on Michael's behalf, and Kaylin won't allow it. This is also a vehicle for her to build some goodwill with the readers by validating their feelings of frustration at Richard's problems with justifiable anger. In this section, the author creates a reversal of roles from the previous chapter when Richard shifts the blame from his brother onto himself when he says that he should have put a stop to it. In chapter 48 of Severed Souls, Zed tells Richard, "Don't blame the victim for the crime. It is not your fault for what others choose to do. Don't let people hang guilt on you if you decide, after all you've done for everyone, after all the sacrifices you have made, to finally live your own life." Goodkind is making a point here that one of the methods used to transform a rational citizen into a faithful citizen is the concept of moral omission. The short version of this argument, which Goodkind will later touch on many times in different ways, is a moral claim is made against an individual who possesses the power or ability to do good or to prevent evil. It claims that those who possess a necessary but rare talent are morally bound to use that for the greater good, making their ability a justification for involuntary servitude. Variations of this argument can be found in contemporary social and political topics of debate. Here's a simplified example designed to convey the moral and social dynamic of this thought process. Consider a group of 10 people, and one of those 10 people knows how to produce food, a necessary skill for the survival of himself and the other 9. The man, being only 10% of the population, is a minority among the group. The other men pass rules agreed upon by the majority of the group that ensure this one man will continue to produce their food for them, but the man growing the food insists upon a rate commensurate for the time invested in acquiring and executing his unique talents. The other 9 feel this is an exploitation of the fruits of their labor because they are not in a position to decline purchasing food from the man and feel taken advantage of. The majority of the group decides to make rules and declare public ownership of a percentage of the man's labor without his consent in the name of the public good. Instead of an equal consideration of value between the man and the man who can grow food, his value is considered to be 1/10 of the population, regardless of their shared position that 100% of the group's survival depends on this 1/10 of the population. The need of the group who does not have the talent to grow food is placed above the needs of the man who can grow the food. The novel Atlas Shrugs takes this example a step further and explores a world where those who have the talents to produce for others simply walk away from that interaction and leave those making claims on what they have done to produce for themselves with nothing. The dynamic of walking away from claims against part of a person's life is heavily present throughout the entire Sword of Truth series. Throughout this exchange, we also see Richard, no longer in direct confrontation with a reality that is impossible to ignore, reverts back to his position that anger is too dangerous to be acknowledged. In response to the shock of actually expressing anger towards his brother, Richard's mind carries the guilt of his actions and puts the full weight of his entire childhood trauma behind it. That misdirection of thought links disappointing his father to expressing anger at Michael's actions. There is another reference to the approaching first day of winter, when Richard observes people taking advantage of the good weather to make repairs on their homes before the cold weather sets in. In this section, Goodkind uses the same technique of credibility transfer with Kaylin's recently acquired goodwill when she says one of the reasons she trusts Richard is that he does not fear the truth. The authors made a point of repeatedly reinforcing Richard's integrity as one of his core defining traits. Given that he's a biased narrator, trusting that his bias is not unfounded is essential for the novels to succeed, and it is accomplished by repeatedly referencing Richard's reliability with everyone he interacts with. Richard then refers to himself as a seeker of the truth, and Kaylin begins what turns into a long tradition of confusing Richard by yelling at him and then changing the subject. We learn that Zed has been calling Richard a seeker of truth for years because of his tendency to always know the truth of things. This interaction makes little sense during the first read-through, and only succeeds at leaving us to wonder why Kaylin would have such a strong reaction immediately after being a calm voice of reason. Finally, Kaylin answers Richard's request to tell him who sent the assassins after her, and we learn the name Darken Rahl. Up to this point, the author shows Kaylin as an unstable character, but we later learn that in addition to the stress of combat and the weight of her own responsibility, she's suffering from PTSD caused by going through the boundary. One of her core character traits is a strength for compartmentalization. Given the enormous strain being placed on that skill right now, in retrospect, it makes perfect sense for her to snap when Richard accidentally references the single most important thing she was sent there to do, much like getting punched in the gut without tensing the muscles first. She has the ability to handle this, but was caught so off guard that for a moment she felt like Richard might have known something she desperately needed to know. The inequality of sharing also makes sense. We see Richard repeatedly reach out to help her get answers from him, but due to the importance of her mission, she cannot allow herself the same luxury. This interaction lends itself much better to analysis after the first reading, and instead of showing an unbalanced character, we realize we're seeing a character who is sacrificing all shreds of humanity for the sake of her mission, and we're shown repeatedly that she can barely carry that psychological weight. In the next section, while they are walking, Richard's hand is mentioned as a growing problem, with dizziness as a new symptom. The author also foreshadows through Richard when he makes a reference to his favorite chair having a squeak. Through Richard's narration while walking down the trail, he notices Kaylin pulling spider webs off of her face. While Richard remembers the story of how his father trusted him with a secret book and the only item that could prove to the rightful owner that it wasn't stolen. Richard notices tracks on the trail leading up to his house. A sudden lack of spider webs to peel off their faces means someone else came along and broke them earlier, and notes that that is unusual. According to the Handy Answer Book for Kids by Gina Misuruglu, it takes approximately 1 hour for the average spider to make an entire web out of silk. However, in an article by RangerPlanet.com, it is also shown that the time you're most likely to see spiders is during the evening because they like to spin their webs between the hours of 6 p.m. and 9 p.m. So if the webs were broken during the late morning or early afternoon, it is most likely that the spiders would wait until that evening to make new ones, even though the task itself can be finished in a single hour. Richard notices that the spider webs don't stop until after the path clears an open plain. He doesn't understand how it could be, but we later learn that Darken Rahl uses a dragon to travel and can drop into a location from the sky. Well, at this moment, Richard does have enough information to make a connection to the flying red beast he saw in the first chapter. He does not put the information together to deduce that the person who is not leaving tracks at his father's house and his is using the sky to travel. They carefully continue towards Richard's house, and when they get there, they see his house has been torn apart. Richard is overcome by shock and almost rushes in. But Kaylin stops him and says that his father probably came home to the very same scene right before he died. Richard says that even though it's dangerous, there's something at his house he will not leave behind. While Richard is recovering his possessions, the author spends 2 separate paragraphs building a deeper amount of importance regarding Richard's ties to nature. We see that everywhere he goes, he does not change or disturb anything. Nature is neither harmed nor subjugated. It's simply navigated. In the Sword of Truth series, Richard is often used as a symbol for the ideal citizen or the ideal man. And how that is shown here is that there is a peace that he surrounds himself with wherever he goes. And that great sense of calm is what removes the irrational emotions that try to overwhelm his sense of reason. Richard's ability to separate his emotions from his logic is symbolized by how peacefully centered he is with nature, and becomes the very key later on he needs to focus his latent magical abilities. Again and again, Goodkind makes a connection between logic and competence. We're given another instance of the Clark Kent effect when we learn that Richard was so overly sentimental that he couldn't bring himself to remove a squeak from a chair because he felt like he would be taking something special away from the chair. If one is still drawing parallels to objectivism, you could also point out that the squeak in the chair was something that gave it value. Objectivism states that when a man is creating value, he's being a good citizen, and says that when a man who does not create value refuses to value the actions of a good citizen, then the man is valuing that which makes us the same, as being more important than that which makes us different but useful. The squeak was unique and contributed value to the chair by setting it apart. To remove and restrict that which is rare and creates value is a failure to recognize the importance of a limited time in our lives. Richard retrieves his backpack as well as the tooth his father gave him and is able to slip away to safety. I've read the scene in this book countless times, and I've always had the question, why wasn't Richard's backpack torn open like the rest of the house? If Darken Rahl was really looking for something of value, then a personal backpack would seem like a logical place to start, and with his knowledge, he would easily recognize a bone from an underworld beast. We later learn that the book Richard was trusted with contains a lot of information about the underworld, and Rahl would be able to put together that the presence of a bone from an underworld beast would likely be linked to a book with underworld information in it. The most likely hypothetical scenario I can think of is that Darken Rahl was aware of the tooth and the backpack, but did not ransack them like he did the rest of the house. We learn in later chapters that Darken Rahl can track a person if they're carrying a bone of a beast that was conjured by his magic. So he leaves the tooth where it is because if Richard comes back while he is gone, he can use it to track him when Richard retrieves it. I bet that Darken Rahl took a look through the backpack but did not disturb it, looking for the book, which he had no way of knowing wouldn't be there. The reason he would have left the pack undisturbed was because he wanted Richard to leave as quickly as possible. We learn that the snake cloud moves with the user, and it's difficult to pinpoint a single location until the person settles for a while. But that means the opposite is also true. Darken Rahl already has an exact location, so when the cloud starts to move again, he will know that Richard has come back and probably left right away, giving him a very accurate timeline of when Richard was at that specific location. It doesn't make sense to explain this detail with the lack of a thorough search of a small wooden cabin, when later in the book we see that Darken Rahl is capable of memorizing entire rituals down to one syllable, with zero margin for error. Given Darken Rahl's character, it's far more likely that the pack and the tooth being undisturbed are part of a calculation of some kind, than it is likely that Darken Rahl just made a mistake, and a very simple one at that. Goodkind often likes to explore ideas in mirrored pairs to reinforce them. He uses this technique when he illustrates an underestimation of Darken Rahl's intelligence. The first example of this is shown at Richard House, and is subtle enough to qualify as a subliminal cue. The second example is after Zed manages to disperse the crowd of people looking to hunt them in Chapter 10. Richard says, Darken Rahl isn't stupid, and then later, he hasn't made a mistake, this was his plan all along. This technique is a very form of subtle and intellectual power scaling. Power scaling is the method of determining a character's strength by comparing them to other characters or people in the series. In this instance, Darken Rahl's intelligence is being compared to that of the average man, and it is made clear his mind makes him very dangerous. Even if Richard were more deductive, he does not have enough information at this point to conclude he's being tracked by the tooth. The only piece of information missing is that the shape of the cloud looks different to the person while they're being tracked, because it is said that from their perspective it looks like a single point or the tip of a cane, but from the side it looks like a long snake. Richard had left the tooth at his house for a period of time. Richard notices the snake-like cloud while he's away from the tooth. If he assumes that there is a reason for his pack and the tooth to be undisturbed, then he would be able to conceive of a scenario where something about the tooth and his pack being undisturbed and noticing it in the same time frame while he also noticed the cloud away from the tooth, he may have been able to deduce that it was a trap to quickly take the pack and the tooth and run. Even if Richard did know about the shape of the cloud, I still think that connection of the dots would have been a little beyond Richard at this moment in his character development. This is more a Blood of the Fold or Temple of the Winds level of deductive reasoning, and Richard is quite a bit more naive in the first book than he is after the fourth one. Richard hides the tooth because he never lets anyone see it. This explains why Zed never found out Richard's connection to the secret book, because Zed likely would have been able to recognize the bone of an underworld beast as well. When Richard wonders about confronting the man inside the house, we're given another example of a narrative tone shift with the phrase, "Something inside him strongly warned him to get away." To me, this suggests intervention from his gift, warning him of the danger. In Chapter 51 of Stone of Tears, we're told that Richard could sense the danger of the Mryswith clearly in his mind, but it wasn't until Chapter 2 of Blood of the Fold that we see Richard fully become aware that his gift is another sense that often warns him of danger when his other senses do not. This follows the same pattern of Richard's progression with other areas of magic. Due to a war wizard's power functioning through need, Richard is often exposed to abilities he has long before he can understand them. One of the reasons I lead toward this passage being a reference to Richard's gift is that in every instance of extreme danger or need that could be explained by the gift, it's also accompanied by the same shift in narrative language. When Richard notes the existence of something inside him pulling him towards an action, these are the only instances where Richard does not narrate himself from a perspective of total knowledge. And this is also consistent with Richard's current character growth. Richard does not accept that he has magic until the end of Stone of Tears, and doesn't recognize himself as having a sense of magic that warns him of danger until after the second book. And since the narration in this chapter is from Richard's perspective, given his normal level of self-awareness and the well-established lack of self-awareness regarding his gift, Richard's gift coming through to warn him makes this the most plausible explanation. Richard comes back and Kaylin asks why he needed to risk his life for a backpack. Richard reminds her that she's still keeping many more secrets from him than he is keeping from her. They leave Richard's house and he notes that he needs to find a place to spend the night. We're introduced to the concept of a wayward pine as a place of shelter. We get another one of Richard's trains of thought. The tooth around his neck makes him think about the knowledge of the secret book. The books at his house had been torn apart just like the books at his father's house. He concludes that the person who killed his father and trashed his house must be looking for the specific secret book. The only reason he dismisses the idea is because he assumes that the only people who were aware of its existence were him, his father, and the true owner of the book. Richard mentions being sapped of all strength as he walked. An article from Healthline.com writes that exerting yourself while you're feverish increases the risk of dehydration and can make a fever worse. Additionally, having a fever decreases muscle strength and endurance and impairs precision and coordination. There's a quick transition when Kaylin grabs Richard's wrist and stops him from swatting a fly. We're then thrown into a story circle while the protagonist Richard is given an unexpected call to adventure where he's told by Kaylin he needs to be still and quiet or they'll both be killed by a powerful monster. Richard is thrown into an unfamiliar situation where he adapts by fighting his natural instincts and resists the urge to swat at the flies. He gets what he was after when the Gar leaves and he pays the heavy price of being terrified and bloodied yet again. He returns to his original zone of comfort when they set out to travel again, having been changed by the encounter and no longer feeling safe enough to stay at the nearest wayward pine. The encounter with the Gar parallels the encounter with emotional gaslighting during Michael's speech in Chapter 3, and acts as an allegory for how the common man can handle that situation. An argument is made with the intention of manipulating a person to accept a predetermined course of action. The argument being made in this allegory is the Gar. The biting flies are the barbs that are sent out to make a person feel like they're in danger or that their sense of agency is being threatened. The trap is when a person engages those barbs in response to the threat. The act of questioning the original claim or the merits of the call to action legitimizes the practice, and that is when the monster strikes. The moment that the monster recognizes that their emotionally charged claims have been engaged, that is when the monster strikes. The Gar attacks the body of those who engage with their flies. The emotional gaslighter attacks the free will of those who engage in fighting or accepting the claims and calls to actions they make through peer pressure and social ostracization. The solution to both problems is the same. The only way to survive unchanged is to endure the sting of the barbs that cannot cause fatal damage and not to engage the aggressor at all. Later in the book, we're given other examples of how Richard handles Gars. The point of this comparison isn't to suggest that non-engagement is the only answer, but at this moment in Richard's character development, he doesn't have the tools to challenge or avoid the situation. Richard begins the series as an everyman archetype, and his lack of power makes him relatable as a character to the reader. The full message shown in this example, as well as the example of those who would use an emotionally charged message to subvert your free will, is that unless you have the power to stop the person making the attack, your best course of action for survival is to not legitimize the situation by engaging it. Because for the manipulation to work, it depends upon a person becoming a slave to their emotions instead of their reason, and lashing out in response to the pain only makes the situation worse. This dynamic is further symbolized by the thorn in Richard's hand. Once he was bit, he was unable to remove the thorn. The more he tried to dig at it, the more Deeply, it would try to wiggle into his body. Instead of making the situation worse by giving in to his instinct to dig the thorn out, he instead listens to his rational mind and realizes that while he cannot fix the problem, he can stop feeding into it and making it worse. Richard tells Kaylin that his repeated brushes with death make him entitled to some of the information that Kaylin has, and she agrees, so long as she does not need to answer any questions about herself. We learn that as a small child, Richard was sick with a fever, and Zed was able to find a root that made him well. The story of caregiving is made to create an expectation of competence regarding Zed and medicine. The reader later learns that is why Richard's mind isn't overly occupied with thoughts of the bite on his hand. In this instance, it is the lack of concern and comparison that establishes Zed as a credible expert for these sorts of things. For safety, the two decide to continue further down the trail and find a different wayward pine to spend the evening in. And Kaylin acts as an advocate for the reader when she asks what a wayward pine is. The smallest of cliffhangers on Chapter 4 leaves this question unanswered. It's time for the official number 1 quote from Seeking the Truth About the Sword of Truth in Wizard's First Rule, Chapter 4. Please note that the views and opinions of what the official number 1 quote from this chapter is may differ from the views and opinions expressed by you about what your number 1 quote from this chapter is. In the event that your number 1 quote is different from the one mentioned here, please list your candidate for number 1 quote in the comments below. And the official number 1 quote is, "With his booty in hand, Richard quickly moved and silently went back the way he had come." Because it makes it sound like Richard is holding his butt when he walks. In the next chapter, Richard and Kaylin spend time together and we learn much about the Midlands and the threat Kaylin is facing. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you feel like you've gotten something of value from this video, please like and subscribe to the channel. If you really like it, I ask that you share a link to this video with those who you think might enjoy it as well. If those feelings are not there yet, I invite you to come back for the next episode and give me a chance to try and change your mind. Thank you for watching. My name is Tom and I've been your guide. This has been Seeking the Truth About the Sword of Truth. Come and join me next time, so while I'm seeking these truths, you can become seekers of those truths as well.